time with you after acknowledgements and just make eye contact or in some way acknowledge Samira so she stops waving signs at you as we hit the 10. Thank you very much. Whenever you're ready.
All right. So hi, my name is Karli Funk, and I will be presenting to you guys today on a holistic model of rehabilitation. So I would first like to acknowledge my advisor, Ms. Carrie Sauter, of course, Dr. Freeland, my mentors, Dr. Jasmine Abrams from the psychology department, and then my mentor, Dr. Jennifer Hughes from the biology department. So I will be presenting to you today on a holistic model of rehabilitation. So I did an interdisciplinary examination of this. Now, back in 2007, my sister faced a severe injury. She tore her ACL in her final basketball game of her senior year of high school. She was going on to Penn State to play as an elite athlete there on their basketball team. But when she got this injury, basketball was never the same for her afterwards. Even though she was physiologically ready to get back there and back on the court, mentally her head was never back in the game again, and she stopped playing. Now, this points us to a few statistics. So there are about 8.6 million sports injuries that occur each year, and many of these injuries also have psychological distress that accompany them. So things maybe like depression, distress, feelings of low self-esteem, and things of that nature. And then we also have an examination conducted by the American College of Sports Medicine that showed that 80% of sports medicine practitioners that were surveyed had discussed these problems with athletes, but 75% of those people had never referred an athlete to a mental health professional, and they were unaware of local counseling resources. That points us to a form of integrated healthcare, which is known as a holistic model of rehabilitation, which we can use in physical therapy. Now, for the purposes of my project, I operationally define this as an approach to physiotherapy treatment in which physical therapists themselves will directly administer psychological tools in clinical practice, in addition to providing your standard traditional biomedical approach to physical therapy. So the purpose of my capstone project was to understand why a holistic model, despite having 30, 40 years worth of research backing its efficacy, is seldom used in local clinical practice. My research goals included identifying the barriers to the use of this model, so what hinders us from using this in practice, and then also finding what's going to help us to bring this into regular practice. I wanted to assess these outcomes in a twofold method, which I'll discuss in just a moment, and I did this in an interdisciplinary fashion. So I wanted to gather primary, tertiary, and secondary data to understand this problem. Now, as I mentioned, I did this in two separate ways. So the first part of my project was to conduct a literature review. Back in last semester, I took a course called HAP 412, which was a research methods in health class. And in this class, I learned a lot about the way in which to conduct a scholarly literature search. And I also used a book called Introduction to Health Research Methods, which is by Katherine Jacobson. And I read that book and learned a lot about the ways in which I should proceed with my search. So I used the UMBC databases to search for my secondary and tertiary data. A lot of the keywords I used included a biopsychosocial approach, psychosocial health, and a biomedical model. I used scholarly peer-reviewed material to do this, but a lot of my data came from meta-analyses and a few randomized controlled trials that are examining this topic right now. The second part of my research involved conducting 2 interviews with local physical therapists. I'm a physical therapy technician at a clinic that is about 5 miles from here. It's called Four Oaks Physical Therapy. So I interviewed the 2 therapists that I work under on a very regular basis, and we conducted phone interviews together. I went through the IRB approval process in order to do this, and then I transcribed these interviews afterwards and met with the therapists to discuss them. Now, through this research, I found 5 key disciplines that emerged as being most prominent. Of course, we already have psychology and biology, which we can identify as huge disciplines in this aspect of things, because we use biology to explain the actual nature of the injury. So what's the physiological damage that's been done? But then psychology is what's happening afterwards. So what are the after effects of that biological injury? So those 2 automatically fuse together in that fashion. But a concept with biology that emerged almost immediately was the use of a biomedical model, which emerges in the education side of this, and also that trickles down into the sociological component of things. Now, with a biomedical model, that's how standard medical practice operates right now. It believes that any kind of injury or illness is the result of a physiological deviation from a homeostatic norm. So something that goes wrong in your body is a result of you not being in homeostasis. So it's mainly biological by that standpoint. But the psychological aspects that emerge include the anxiety and the fear of return to sport, and a lot of distress that emerges during that rehabilitation of the injury. Now, education, public policy, and sociology emerged as the disciplines which provided both barriers and facilitators to the use of a holistic model. Within education, we have concepts such as continuing education programs and entry-level doctorate physical therapy programs that emerge as being most prominent concepts. And within public policy, or more specifically health policy, it's issues with reimbursement, coding, billing, and insurance that often pose a threat to the use of holistic healthcare. Within sociology, concepts such as the patient-therapist interaction and the overall culture of physical therapy can also either facilitate or hinder the use of holistic healthcare. Within this project, I allocated my time in a fashion such that I would have a bit of time in the beginning that was spent on my IRB approval. I spent an ample amount of time interviewing my therapist afterwards and making sure that I had conducted interviews in which I could use a lot of the data for my project. A lot of my time has been spent writing and creating my Type 1 capstone paper, and much of my research time was also spent finding secondary and tertiary data through the UMBC databases. Of course, I've also conducted an SOI component of this paper, and then I also spent a lot of time creating this presentation as well, so it basically evened out this way here. Now, from those 5 disciplines that I just mentioned, I had 3 key strategies that emerged. So my first is bridging the explanation-action gap, which really, in my opinion, serves as the foundation for this project, and that is why it was so useful to me. So psychology and biology serve as the problem. They demonstrate what's happening in healthcare right now that's an issue. So it's that we're having these psychological problems that result from the biological issues, but there's not much being done to address it. And then we use those 3 disciplines that I just mentioned of public policy, education, and sociology to provide the explanatory, action-oriented leverage to explain how we can have those solutions to the problem. Now, with building complex multi-causal explanations, this was extremely important because it illustrates a key barrier to the use of this form of healthcare. I mentioned the biomedical model to you, and that is what's mainly being taught at entry-level doctorate of physical therapy programs. So that's learned early in the stages of education, and then it continues into clinical practice in the 3rd year of physical therapy school, and that's what people continue to learn when they're becoming physical therapists. So by the time they get into actual clinical practice, they've learned a biomedical approach. They teach their patients that approach, so the patient comes in with the expectation that they're only going to get treatment for whatever is physiologically wrong with them. There's no expectation of psychological help in any way, shape, or form. So what arises is that there's a culture of physical therapy that's established in which the patient expects biological treatment and the therapist expects to administer biological treatment. And the two aren't really combining with psychology. So this really illustrated one of the biggest barriers, in my opinion. However, redefinition can be used to show a facilitator, and that we combine psychology and biology to redefine physical therapy so that it covers both the psychological and biological bases of things. Then that way we can address the issues in health policy, which are that we have trouble billing for integrated healthcare because it's difficult to bill for the use of a psychological intervention in a realm that doesn't normally seem like it would have psychological interventions being used in it. So by redefining physical therapy so that we cover both psychology and biology, then that way when we bill for healthcare, we can include tools such as imagery, goal setting, visualization, things of that nature that are psychological components. They can now be regularly used in physical therapy. So those are the 3 strategies that I found most important to my project. Now there's a lot going on in the field right now with this. So there are many current studies going on. So right now one was just conducted in Singapore just a few months ago, and it examined the physical therapist perspectives on the use of psychological treatment in pain management. Then there are also clinical trials going on right now in which therapists take education training programs, and these can last anywhere from maybe a week up to a month, in which the therapist attends regular educational sessions, and they learn how to use tools that are subtle psychological tactics to address maybe conditions such as low self-esteem or depression. And as I mentioned, those could include things like goal setting or imagery or visualization, things of that nature where it's not overly invasive. And then also, the American Physical Therapy Association is now offering continuing education courses that include things such as emotional intelligence for health professionals, so learning how to speak to patients about their emotional conditions. And also geriatric care, they're looking at taking a more biopsychosocial approach to that now. And then next month, Johns Hopkins is actually hosting a psychologically informed physical therapy program, which has an educational module for therapists to take online, and then they attend the session afterwards. So this is emerging a lot more in the field now. And then for seminal works, I found that the 2016 consensus statement on return to sport was very integral to my work because they use a psychological framework, it's called a START program, in order to dictate when an athlete is able to return to sport. So they must be psychologically and physiologically sound. And then of course the biopsychosocial model emerged in 1977, and that was through the work of Dr. Engel. Now my outcomes for my project showed me that I had a few key disciplines that emerged. As I mentioned earlier, we had biology, psychology, public policy, education, sociology. A lot of insight was gained into the local perspective of two physical therapists, and that is the one component that I do believe is unique about my project. Many therapists have been interviewed about their perspective on a biopsychosocial or holistic approach to healthcare, but this was unique just to this particular region that we had near UMBC. And then this also allowed for the interdisciplinary connections to be made. However, there were definitely limitations to my research in that I only interviewed 2 physical therapists. I also work at an orthopedic outpatient clinic, so I would like to do a larger sample size in which I look at maybe inpatient work or acute care, because those are drastically different settings in which in acute care, the psychological aspects of that would be much greater than that of an orthopedic outpatient clinic. So I would love to have a greater number of interviews, and then I would also like to be able to conduct follow-up interviews. Within my research, I was able to easily find out information about barriers to holistic healthcare, but learning about facilitators was a little bit more difficult. So I think that it would be necessary to conduct follow-up interviews after this. But I greatly enjoyed doing this project, and I hope that you guys loved hearing about it also.